January the 17th, 1944, Cassino, Italy. The winter rain hammered down on the broken stones of what had once been a monastery. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann crouched in a shell hole, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from something he could not name. Through the smoke and mist, he watched them come again, American infantrymen of the 36th Division, ascending the muddy slope for the third time that day. His machine gun had cut down dozens that morning. He had seen their bodies tumble backward into the rocks. He had watched their formations shatter under his fire. And yet, here they came again, their rifles held steady, their voices calling out to one another through the chaos, as if death itself had not just reached out and claimed their brothers. Hartmann had been told many things about the Americans, that they were soft, that they were shopkeepers and farm boys playing at war, that they would break at the first taste of real violence. But as he pressed his eye to the sight and prepared to fire again, he felt the first cold finger of doubt trace down his spine. These men did not move like the broken, they moved like the faithful. The Second World War had, by 1944, become a vast furnace consuming millions. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had built their military doctrines on philosophies of superiority, discipline, and the iron will of the state. Their soldiers were raised to believe that sacrifice for the nation was the highest virtue, that endurance under suffering proved racial and cultural strength, and that lesser peoples would crumble when faced with true warriors. The German Wehrmacht prided itself on tactical brilliance and the hardness of its men. The Imperial Japanese Army taught its soldiers that surrender was disgrace, that death was preferable to capture, and that the enemy, particularly the Western enemy, lacked the spiritual fortitude for prolonged conflict. These were not mere propaganda slogans, they were foundational beliefs taught in schools, preached in barracks, woven into the very identity of the soldier. When Axis forces first encountered American troops in significant numbers in North Africa in 1942, in the Pacific Islands that same year, many officers expected confirmation of their assumptions. Early American performance was uneven. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, German armor had routed inexperienced American units, sending them fleeing into the desert. Japanese commanders on Guadalcanal watched U.S. Marines struggle in the jungle and assumed the softness they had been promised. But something unexpected began to emerge in the months that followed, something that unsettled the careful certainties of Axis military thought. It was not that the Americans fought without fear, it was that they fought through fear, and when they fell, others stepped forward as if the losses had only clarified their purpose. Hartmann fired. The machine gun bucked against his shoulder, spitting fire down the hill. He saw 2 Americans fall, then 3. But the line did not stop. It adjusted, flowed around the dead like water around stones, and kept coming. An artillery shell burst to his left, showering him with mud and shrapnel. When his vision cleared, the Americans were closer. One of them was shouting, not in panic, but in coordination, directing his squad to cover. Hartmann's loader, a young conscript from Bavaria, whispered a prayer. They had held this position for 6 days. They had inflicted terrible casualties. And still the Americans attacked. What the Axis soldiers could not understand, what their training had not prepared them for, was the nature of American morale. It was not built on the expectation of invincibility. It was not sustained by the cult of the leader or the mystique of an ancient warrior tradition. It was something more ordinary and, paradoxically, more resilient. It grew from the belief that the cause was just, that the society they defended was worth the cost, and that their brothers beside them would not abandon the fight. When an American unit suffered 50% casualties and continued to attack, it violated every principle of military psychology that Axis commanders had studied. Men were supposed to break at 30% losses. They were supposed to flee, to surrender, to collapse into self-preservation. The Americans buried their dead and loaded fresh ammunition. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers witnessed this phenomenon with a horror that bordered on the supernatural. On Peleliu, in the autumn of 1944, Marines assaulted fortified coral ridges again and again. The 1st Marine Regiment suffered more than 60% casualties in the first week. Japanese Colonel Kunio Nakagawa watched through field glasses as the Marines, bloodied and exhausted, regrouped and attacked once more. He wrote in his diary that the enemy seemed possessed by a spirit we do not comprehend, not the spirit of the warrior seeking glorious death, but something colder and more determined, as if they calculate the cost and pay it willingly without the consolation of honor or the promise of paradise. Nakagawa had been taught that Americans valued their lives too much to die in large numbers for abstract principles, but on Peleliu, the Marines demonstrated that they would pay any price to take the ground. They did not seek death, but they did not flee from it either. This terrified the Japanese more than savagery or recklessness would have. It suggested a kind of morale that could not be exhausted because it was not based on illusion. The German experience was similar, though framed differently. In the hedgerows of Normandy, in the Hürtgen forest, in the snows around Bastogne, Wehrmacht veterans, men who had survived the Eastern Front, who had seen the worst of war, found themselves shaken by the persistence of American infantry. A captured officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, interrogated after the Battle of Saint-Lô, admitted that his men had expected the Americans to withdraw after the first week of brutal attrition. "We killed them by the hundreds," he said, his voice hollow. "We saw their bodies in the roads, and the next day more came. They did not seem diminished. They seemed angrier." This was not the reaction predicted by Axis doctrine. Losses were supposed to demoralize. Instead, they seemed to harden American resolve. Hartmann's machine gun clicked empty. His hands fumbled for a fresh belt, but his loader was staring past him, eyes wide. Hartmann turned. An American soldier stood 10 meters away, rifle leveled, face streaked with mud and blood. For a moment neither man moved. Hartmann saw the soldier's hands shaking, saw the exhaustion carved into his young face, but he also saw the eyes, focused, unwavering, making the calculation. The American could have fired. Instead, he barked a command. Hartmann raised his hands. The POW cages filled with men like Hartmann, men who had fought hard and surrendered only when resistance became meaningless, and in those cages another shock awaited them. The food arrived in trucks, rations in tin cans, white bread, chocolate bars, cigarettes. A German sergeant from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division stared at the meal placed before him: meat, vegetables, coffee with sugar. He had not eaten so well in a year. His captors, the men who had just defeated him, ate the same rations prepared the same way. There was no starvation, no cruelty, no vengeance. An American guard, noticing his expression, shrugged and said something in English that a translator conveyed. "We got plenty." This abundance became a symbol as potent as any weapon. Axis soldiers had been told that America was decadent, weak, collapsing under the weight of its own excess. But the evidence before them suggested something else, a nation so vast and productive that it could feed its enemies while fighting a war on two hemispheres. The chocolate bar handed to a captured German paratrooper, the cigarette offered to a Japanese prisoner, the clean bandages applied to enemy wounds. These small acts carried an ideological weight that no propaganda could counter. They whispered a simple, devastating truth. You cannot outlast this. You cannot starve them. You cannot break them. They have more of everything, and they will share it even with you. In the Philippine jungles, a Japanese lieutenant named Hiroshi Tanaka survived the fall of Manila and spent weeks evading American patrols. When he was finally captured, injured, and delirious, he was taken to a field hospital. American medics treated his wounds with the same urgency they gave their own. He received plasma, sulfur drugs, morphine. When he regained consciousness, he wept not from pain, but from the collapse of every certainty he had carried into the war. He had been taught that the Americans were animals, that they would torture and mutilate prisoners. Instead, they had saved his life. In his later testimony, recorded after the war, Tanaka spoke of this moment as a spiritual rupture. "I realized then," he said, "that we had been fighting against something we did not understand, not an empire, not an army, but an idea that could afford mercy because it believed in its own survival." The morale of the American soldier was rooted in this idea, the notion that the individual mattered, that the democratic society was worth defending, and that victory would mean the preservation of a way of life, not the glory of conquest. When an American unit suffered losses, the survivors did not see their sacrifices wasted. They saw it as necessary, part of a collective effort that transcended individual survival. This was not fanaticism. It was something quieter and more durable, belief in a purpose larger than the self, sustained by trust in comrades and confidence in the nation's capacity to endure. Hartmann sat in the POW camp in southern Italy and watched American soldiers play baseball in a muddy field. They laughed, shouted, argued over rules. The sound of it, ordinary, boisterous, alive, haunted him. His own army had been built on discipline and order, on the suppression of the individual for the sake of the whole. But these men seemed to carry their individuality with them even into war, and somehow it made them stronger, not weaker. He thought of the men who had kept coming up that hill, and he understood finally that he had not been defeated by superior tactics or overwhelming firepower. He had been defeated by a kind of faith he had not believed possible. The transformation this wrought in Axis perception was gradual but profound. Soldiers who had mocked the Americans in 1942 spoke of them with grim respect by 1945. The myth of the soft, undisciplined enemy crumbled in the face of relentless evidence. The Americans could be beaten in individual battles, but they could not be made to quit. Their morale did not depend on victory, it preceded it, made it inevitable. The German soldier learned this in the Rhineland, the Japanese soldier learned it on Okinawa, and in learning it, they confronted the failure of their own ideologies, the realization that will alone could not overcome a nation that married determination to industrial might, that fused individual freedom with collective purpose. The war ended, as all wars do, with the defeated seeking to understand their defeat. In the interrogation records, in the diaries, in the memoirs written years later, a common theme emerges, the shock of encountering an enemy whose morale seemed unbreakable, not because they loved death, but because they believed in life, in the life they were defending, in the lives of the men beside them, in the life they would return to when the fighting ended. The Axis soldiers had been taught that such sentimentality was weakness. They learned, at terrible cost, that it was a kind of strength they could not match. And so the memory of those battles, the Americans climbing the hill again, the Marines attacking through fire, the riflemen who did not stop when their friends fell, became a testimony to something the Axis powers had not believed existed, a morale born not from compulsion or ideology, but from the simple, stubborn conviction that freedom was worth the blood it demanded, and that a nation built on such freedom could endure any storm, suffer any loss, and still come forward, steady and unbroken, into the smoke